Much of history is dark and downright scary. Some of that is captured in history books between sections of heroes and descriptions of what life was like for our ancestors. But much is kept secret or simply glossed over. Number 5. There are many famous men and women from the past whose tombs have been forgotten. From Alexander the Great to Cleopatra of Egypt, it's a reminder that no matter a person's importance, time will wash away most things. But in the case of Dante Alighieri, it was politics rather than time that has left his remains without a home for most of his afterlife so far. Dante was a poet, born in Florence in 1265. He's most famous today for his work, The Inferno, which was one part of a trilogy called The Divine Comedy. Set to the backdrop of a trip to hell, Dante used his story to condemn certain religious and political figures. These included the Pope, as well as political figures from his home state of Florence. It's unsurprising then that Dante did not exactly get along with these people and had himself exiled from Florence in the early 1300s. Years later, he would be offered a chance to return, but he would not agree with the conditions and instead settled in Ravenna. Ravenna welcomed Dante, and when he passed away from natural causes in 1321, an extravagant funeral was held. His body was placed in a marble sarcophagus at the church known today as the Basilica of San Francesco. An epitaph was later written describing Florence as an unloving mother. But over the years, public opinion on Dante in Florence changed. Despite his criticisms of the city, over the following generations, his fame would lead to Florence being proud to call him one of its sons, and authorities requested the return of his remains. Ravenna refused, and eventually the new pope, who was related to Florence's ruling family, ordered the body to be returned. Ravenna let Florence take the sarcophagus, but it was soon discovered Dante's remains were not inside. The bones of the famous poet were now hidden in a wooden chest in the church, but Florence couldn't reveal the truth without admitting that they had opened the tomb. For a while, Dante's remains were deemed lost after they'd been hidden during the Napoleonic Wars, only to be rediscovered during construction work in 1865. A student noticed the label, Dante's Ossa, on the box, which indicated the complete skeleton found inside was indeed the famous poet. The remains were put on public display for a time, although they were briefly buried during World War II. Finally, in December of 1945, they were laid to rest in a mausoleum in Ravenna, where Dante presumably remains to this day. Number 4. The Cuban Missile Crisis is one of the most significant events to occur in the second half of the 20th century. Given the amount of espionage and counterintelligence that defined the Cold War, it's not surprising that much of the story of the crisis is left out of history books. In particular, the US government was keen to keep quiet just how big a role it played in kicking off the crisis. Despite what John F. Kennedy claimed as he campaigned for his election, the US had a much larger nuclear arsenal than its Cold War enemy, and in 1961, more than 100 were deployed in Turkey, as close to the Soviet Union as they could be. These weapons weren't of much use as a deterrent, and seemed to be obviously intended for a first strike to anyone who knew they were there. Even US senators were asking what their own government's response would be like if the Soviet Union attempted something similar, such as a deployment in Cuba. Once the missile crisis kicked off, Kennedy himself said either absent-mindedly or sarcastically that the Soviet actions in Cuba was like if the US suddenly began to put a major number of missiles in Turkey. He described that sort of action as dangerous. When the crisis began, Many observers from the rest of the world believed America was escalating the situation far more than it needed to, and it seemed like nuclear war was imminent. In fact, if a handful of coincidences had gone differently, it's very likely the Cold War would have gone hot. As the Executive Committee of the National Security Council observed early on in the crisis, the missiles in Cuba didn't change much. They were not a military danger, but a political one. The Kennedy administration had committed to being tough on Cuba, and one of the biggest concerns was what these missiles would do to America's image in the Soviet Union's eyes, and the eyes of America's own allies. The biggest secret came at the end of the crisis, in how the US convinced the Soviets to leave Cuba. For decades after the crisis, it was well known that the US's willingness to back down and the threat of military action convinced the Soviet Union the weapons in Cuba weren't worth the risk. In actuality, Kennedy had struck a secret deal with the Soviets, agreeing to remove the missiles from Turkey. If the deal ever got leaked, it would be off. The president's brother hand-delivered the letter outlining the agreement to the ambassador himself, and refused to take the USSR's letter formally agreeing to the arrangement, as it would risk ruining his career. Eventually, the documents related to the event were declassified, though the Pentagon still redacted any mention of Turkey from its files on the subject. But the myths surrounding the US resolve in the Cuban Missile Crisis and its relative innocence in causing the crisis is still commonly believed. Number 3. For those outside of the United Kingdom, Coventry is probably not a place that they're familiar with, and even for most inside the UK, it's not particularly special. But it was in the skies over the West Midlands city that British morale during the Second World War was first shaken, and it may have been something the government could have prevented. Coventry at the time was a relatively small city, but was dense with factories dotted between medieval architecture, and had expanded rapidly to house those working at the factories. Before the war, cars had been the main output, but wartime manufacturing switched to weapons and other things that would help the effort. Naturally, it became a target for German air raids, but unlike London, the city was much less prepared for an attack. November 14, 1940 started out like any other day. By the next morning, 568 people would have lost their lives, and a state of panic had gripped much of the city. It was the heaviest bombardment that had been set up until that point in the war, and the most intense. But nowhere else in the country would come close to the societal collapse and hysteria that was seen in Coventry. Rumors of people buried under collapsing buildings, being fed through tubes circulated. There were stories about perfectly civil people who formed a violent mob. An anthropologist visiting the city the following day claimed to see women attacking firefighters and said there was more hysteria, terror, and neurosis observed in one evening than he'd seen across the entire country in 2 months. How much of the violent attacks were real and how much were just horror stories remains unknown. Blame was placed on the local governments for not being prepared with the proper emergency water supplies, which only added to the destruction as much of the city burned to the ground. The ruins of Coventry Cathedral still stand today as a testament to this. But even worse than the unpreparedness is that the UK government may have known the attack was coming that day. According to some theories, the codebreakers had informed Prime Minister Winston Churchill that German codes indicated an attack on Coventry, even given the planned time. But to send manpower and support to Coventry at that time would make it clear to Germans that UK intelligence had cracked their codes. If that happened, the codes would no doubt be changed, and the UK would lose its advantage. Churchill claimed the upcoming raid would be on London, and sent reinforcements there instead. How true this theory is will likely never be known, though it's one that is rarely mentioned outside of Coventry. What is true is that in the aftermath of the attack, the government began to censor coverage of the event so as not to damage morale, and today it's widely ignored. Number 2. The assassination of Conrad de Montferrat is one of history's greatest whodunits, with some of the most famous names of medieval Europe being suspected in the crime. Conrad was the king of Jerusalem, though he had only held the title for a matter of days before 2 assassins took his life. One of the assassins passed away at the scene, while another was captured and tortured for information about who had hired them. The pair had been in Conrad's court for months beforehand, and were members of the Nizari Ismaili, the assassins of legend. It wasn't unheard of for them to be involved in crusader affairs, and rumors of their heinous acts often spread through Christendom. But it was still a shock when the captured assassin named Richard the Lionheart as being involved in the scheme. Conrad had been a part of a political dispute surrounding the King of Jerusalem, which didn't actually include the city at the time. After Queen Sibylla passed away in 1190, her husband, Guy, believed the crown would pass to him. However, the court of Jerusalem recognized Sibylla's younger sister, Isabella, as the rightful heir. Queens could not rule alone though, and she would need a husband. Conrad was the favorite of the court and of much of Europe. His family had connections to the Holy Roman Emperor, the Byzantine Emperor, and the French monarchy. He was actually a cousin of the King of France. The only significant figure to support Guy was Richard the Lionheart. However, by the end of the Third Crusade, it seemed Richard had accepted Conrad as king. Guy had been given a consolation kingdom in Cyprus, and Conrad was elected king. Then there was the assassination. Richard was arrested in France on his way back from the crusade, on charges that included a number of things, as well as responsibility for the passing of Conrad. His mother had to give up all the money in the treasury to bring him home. However, he wasn't the only suspect. Even though Guy didn't try to take the crown after Conrad's passing, it was still considered possible that he was involved. Another possibility was Richard's nephew, Henry, who took the crown afterwards. Henry never used the title king in any official documentation, and he met with the leader of the assassins during his rule. Other possibilities included Isabella's first husband, or even the leader of the assassins himself, who may have been slighted by Conrad in the past and had played the long game before taking his life. It's a little talked about scandal at the end of the largely romanced crusade, and one that will likely never get a conclusive answer. Number 1. The Boer Wars are an often overlooked conflict, especially outside of South Africa, where they took place. Taking place only a few decades before the First World War, most history books will skip over the time period entirely. The dark events and even darker actions performed by the British military go ignored, despite one of the biggest perpetrators being the face of Britain's World War I efforts. South Africa at the end of the 1800s was a complicated place. As well as the native Africans, there were also descendants of Dutch settlers, the Boers, who had lived in the area for generations, and the British. When the Boers tried to set up their own independent nations, conflict with the British began. In March of 1900, the Supreme Commander of the British forces, Lord Roberts, offered the Boers that put down their weapons an amnesty. They could remain on their farms as long as they signed an oath of neutrality. A third of the Boer population took the offer, and all was well for them for a few more months before the British began their most heinous acts. The remaining forces had begun attacking railway lines. At first, the British would retaliate by burning down the farms and settlements nearest the railway lines, but this soon turned into unprovoked attacks. The scorched earth policy left homes destroyed, farms salted, and livestock either confiscated or killed. To stop the Boers that had put down their weapons from being convinced to rejoin the fight, they were placed in refugee camps. It was supposedly for their own protection, but the barbed wire fence made it seem more like a prison. Families that had been left homeless and without any way to support themselves were also sent to the camps. Disease ran rampant, with young children particularly susceptible. In November of 1900, Lord Kitchener took over from Roberts. The scorched earth policy wasn't getting the results he desired, and with the enemy forces still hiding in the shadows, Kitchener targeted the people he could get a hold of, the families of the Boer fighters. Women and children were forcibly relocated to the concentration camps in ox wagons. Food supply in the camps was already terrible, but those whose families were still fighting received even less. Malnutrition only made fighting the disease even harder. 28,000 Boers, a third of the population at the time, were wiped out in the camps. Those in charge wrote callous letters to one another, expressing disappointment that the high rates had continued, even after those they saw as weak had perished. The atrocities would likely have been worse had in late 1902, a British welfare campaigner had not seen the horrors and reported it back to the media at home. Black South Africans were also rounded up into camps. Their farms and homes were also burned to the ground, so Boer fighters couldn't get resources from them. Conditions at these camps were even worse, and outrage in Britain over the treatment of the Boers did not spread to outrage over the treatment of Black Africans. 20,000 people passed away in these camps. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But I've been Ty Knots, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.